17-ton steel jaws drop into the hold of a lake freighter and close on a bite of raw iron ore, packed hard by its own weight on the trip down from Lake Superior. A man rides down inside the machine's own leg to watch it happen from a few feet above the bucket, and he comes back up with the load. In about 50 seconds, he will go down and do it again. 4 of these machines went to work in 1912 on Cleveland's Cleveland and Pittsburgh ore dock on Whiskey Island, each one rated to move 1,000 tons of ore an hour. In 2024, the last 2 of them left that dock as roughly 1,600 tons of cut scrap steel. Nothing had broken. The machines carried a plaque from the American Society of Mechanical Engineers naming them a machine that changed how an entire industry worked, and the city had made them a protected landmark years earlier. By the time the torches reached them, they had already been lying on the ground in numbered pieces for a quarter of a century, while everyone with a say in the matter agreed they were worth saving. Every time those jaws closed on a bite of ore, the electric motor doing the work stalled dead, and the engineers wanted it that way. On every closing of the bucket, by design, the machine was shoved past the point where its own motor could keep turning, and it was built to take that and carry on. It did that thousands of times a season, on one dock, for 80 years. If you enjoy these documentaries, then subscribe. Thank you. Now back to the gritty history. Before any machine could rip a bite out of a ship's hold, somebody had to reckon with what was sitting inside that hold, because raw iron ore is not cargo that wants to leave a ship on its own. It sits in a packed mass, settled by its own weight and weeks of vibration on the lake, and it does not pour and does not slide the way people assume a bulk cargo will. Getting it out meant putting men down into the dark of the hold with hand tools, hundreds of times a season, one boat at a time. Every boat that could not be unloaded quickly sat idle at the dock instead of sailing back up to Lake Superior for another load, and idle time was money a shipping company could not get back. The method that stood for most of the 19th century started with building a wooden staging inside the hold itself, a rough platform the crew put together before the unloading could even begin. Ore was shoveled up off the bottom of the hold onto that staging, then shoveled again from the staging up to deck level, then loaded by hand into wheelbarrows and rolled off the ship. A typical schooner of the era carried around 300 tons of ore, and unloading her by hand took close to 4 days, at a cost of roughly 50 cents a ton. 50 cents a ton sounds small until it is multiplied across a whole season of boats and on a Great Lakes ore trade already running on thin margins that cost sat squarely between a mine that had already dug the ore and a furnace waiting to burn it. Some docks paired shovel crews with block and tackle rigs pulled by horses, and one outfit on the lakes, Bothwell and Morris, worked a single schooner with about 40 horses. In good conditions, a crew of about 50 men with shovels could move something like 3,000 tons of ore off a ship in about 24 hours. When the ore had frozen solid in the hold on the trip down from Lake Superior, which happened often enough to matter, that same job could stretch into several days. The first real break from pure shovel labor came in 1867, when a dock owner named J. D. Bothwell put a small portable steam engine to work hoisting ore out of a ship's hold, 3 tubs at a time, on a design by Robert Wallace. It emptied a bark in a single working day, a result fast enough that 9 more of the machines were ordered almost immediately. It was a start rather than a solution, because it still needed men down in the hold filling those tubs by hand. The next real advance came from Alexander Brown, who built a cable-operated rig nicknamed the Tom Collins in 1880, and by 1882 had 5 of his hoists working Cleveland's New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio dock. Brown's machine used a self-filling grab bucket on the end of a cable, taking roughly 1.5 tons of ore on each pass, and it pushed the cost of unloading down to around 18 cents a ton. Later versions of Brown's design, sold as the Brown Electric Fast Plant, added a man-carrying trolley so an operator could ride out with the bucket instead of working it from a fixed post on the dock. a step toward putting a man closer to the load, though the bucket underneath him still hung from a cable and still swung. Brown's hoists ran the lower lake docks for the next 20 years and more, and for a while the ore handling problem looked solved. The problem was not solved, and the reason was physics rather than ambition. A bucket hanging from a cable swings. It swings going down into the hold, it swings coming back up loaded, and a swinging load of steel cannot be driven straight down through a narrow hatch without banging against the hatch coamings on the way in. Nor can it be steered sideways to dig ore out from under the deck, where a large share of every cargo always ended up sitting. A cable-hung bucket could clear ore from the open middle of a hold all day long. The ore hiding at the edges still had to be brought in by men with shovels before the bucket could reach it. That was the problem waiting for George Hulett. Hulett was born in Hulett, Ohio in 1846, and he did not come up through an engineering school or an apprenticeship on the docks. He left formal schooling at 18 and spent more than a quarter century in general retail and in the produce and commission trade before he ever touched heavy machinery. In 1890, already in his 40s, he went to work for a manufacturer that built equipment for the coal and ore trade, and it was there, watching cable-hung buckets fail to reach ore packed against a hull, that he worked out what the industry needed. He filed for a patent in 1898. What he had designed went well beyond a bigger version of Brown's bucket. It solved the swinging problem by refusing to let the bucket swing at all, locking it instead to a rigid arm that a man could ride down into the hold and steer by hand, bite by bite, into corners no cable-hung bucket could ever have reached. Hulett kept refining the design through work with Variety Iron Works in 1898 and McMyler Manufacturing in 1899, though the very first machine came off the floor at Webster, Camp and Lane in Akron. He lived until January of 1923, long enough to watch his invention become standard equipment on ore docks across the Great Lakes, and in 2006 he was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame for it. He did not build a bigger grab, he built a machine that put a man inside the ship's hold and never let go of the bucket. The first working Hulett went into service in 1899 at Carnegie Steel's docks in Hulett, Ohio, the same small port where Hulett had grown up. Andrew Carnegie paid $40,000 for that first machine, a considerable sum for a single piece of dockside equipment, and by 1901 there were 5 of them working the Conneaut docks together. To see what made this thing different from everything that came before it, you have to look at how it was built, piece by piece, because the whole idea lived in the engineering rather than in the size of the bucket. The machine itself was a traveling gantry, a bridge of steel that rode on 2 parallel rail tracks running the length of the dock, carried on 4 8-wheel trucks, and spanning as many as 4 sets of railroad trackway underneath it. Across the top of that gantry ran 2 heavy parallel girders set at right angles to the face of the dock, and along those girders a carriage, sometimes called a trolley, could travel out over a ship, tied up alongside and back over the dock itself. This much is standard heavy industrial engineering, the kind of steel bridgework you would find on any large crane of the period. The part that made it a Hulett hung underneath that carriage. From the carriage hung a long pivoted walking beam, and at the outer end of that beam sat a rigid vertical leg, a steel column that did not swing on a cable the way every earlier grab bucket had. Bolted to the bottom of that leg was the bucket, the jaws that did the actual work. Because the leg was rigid rather than hung from rope, the operator could drive it straight down through a hatch without the bucket swinging into the coamings on the way in, something that had been physically impossible with Brown's cable-hung buckets. Because the leg was rigid, it could also be steered. The whole leg could rotate 90 degrees, letting the bucket scrape fore and aft between the frames of the hatch, and the bucket itself was mounted off-center on the leg so it could reach in under the deck, into space no vertical drop could ever have found. That off-center reach let the machine clean out cargo that a straight-down bucket would have left behind for men to shovel out by hand. Open all the way, the jaws on one of these buckets spread about 21 feet from point to point. wide enough to bite across most of a hatch in a single pass. Riding inside that leg, in a small glassed-in cab built above the bucket, sat one of the machine's two operators. A period photograph from the machine's early years carries a caption that puts his job about as plainly as it can be put, describing him as the man in the leg of the first unloader, and noting that he dives in and out of the hold as bucket operator all day long. He went down with the bucket every cycle, watching the jaws bite into the ore from a few feet above them, and he came back up with it, cycle after cycle, for the length of a shift. A second operator worked from the carriage itself, controlling how it moved out and back along the girders, and how the whole gantry crept along the dock to line up with each hatch on the ship. Learning either job took real time. Reports from the period put the training needed to make an efficient Hulett operator at around 5 years. The two men worked in constant coordination, since the leg operator's descent into the hold only mattered if the carriage operator had already lined the bucket up over the right hatch, and the whole cycle went nowhere if the Larry car was not already in position to take what came up. Two more pieces of the mechanism carry the story forward. The walking beam that the leg hung from was deliberately overbalanced by about 6,000 pounds, weighted so that gravity itself helped drive the leg down into the hold rather than fighting it the whole way. That overbalance made the downward stroke fast and close to free, at the cost of a machine that was always, by design, trying to fall. Once a full bucket came back up out of the hold, it swung over to a hopper, sometimes called a Larry car, running on its own track between the two main girders, carrying the ore out over the dock and dropping it into waiting railroad cars or onto the stockpile beside the tracks. 6 separate motions, each running off its own motor, made all of this happen together. The carriage traveling in and out, the leg tilting, the bucket rotating, the bucket opening and closing, the Larry car running its track, and the entire gantry creeping the length of the dock. 6 mechanisms working as one, controlled by 2 men, most of the exposure carried by the one riding down in the leg. The early steam-powered machines at Conneaut used a 10-ton bucket and were rated at 275 tons an hour, a number the machines went on to beat. In one documented test, 4 steam Huletts moved 7,257 gross tons of ore in 4.5 hours, better than 400 tons per machine per hour on average, with one machine alone hitting a peak of 681 tons in an hour. Numbers like that, produced on a working dock rather than in a demonstration, were what made other ports pay attention. Carnegie's $40,000 bet on that first machine looked justified within a season or two, once 4 steam Huletts were routinely beating their own rated capacity by close to 50%, the kind of return that gets machinery salesmen invited into other companies' offices. A period spec sheet for those early Conneaut machines gives some sense of scale before Cleveland's larger machines arrived a decade later, around 950 tons of steel, 88 feet tall, 36 feet wide at the base, with a main girder spanning 134 feet across the dock. By 1913, 54 Huletts were in service on the Great Lakes, and ore docks from Conneaut to Cleveland to Gary, Indiana, were being rebuilt around a machine that had not existed 15 years before. The machine kept spreading after that. More than 75 Huletts were built in total between 1898 and 1960, most of them by Wellman Seaver Morgan of Cleveland, and at their peak, around 77 of them were working the Great Lakes at once. Roughly 45 clustered around Cleveland, Lake Erie, and the Cuyahoga River, with 14 of those inside Cleveland itself. 5 more went to work at Gary, Indiana, and 2 handled coal rather than ore on Lake Superior. One Hulett, in a use nobody at Conneaut could have pictured watching that first steam machine claw ore out of a hold, ended up in New York City unloading garbage. A design built to solve one very specific problem, a hold of frozen ore that would not come out any other way, turned out flexible enough to handle almost anything sold and shipped in bulk. Cleveland's Cleveland and Pittsburgh ore dock opened in 1912 on Whiskey Island, and it opened with 4 Huletts built for the Pennsylvania Railroad by the Wellman Seaver Morgan Company, machines that made the Conneaut originals look like early drafts. These ran on electricity rather than steam, powered by 220-volt direct current, with jaws rated to lift 17 tons of ore in a single bite. The Conneaut machines had closed their jaws hydraulically. The Cleveland machines used a dedicated motor for the same job, one more sign of how much engineering effort had gone into the single act of squeezing a bucket shut around 17 tons of ore. An engineering landmark survey done decades later by the American Society of Mechanical Engineers put each machine at about 108 feet long, 19 feet wide, and roughly 96 feet tall, with the leg pulled up, weighing in around 550 tons. The record disagrees with itself about the size of these machines. The Encyclopedia of Cleveland History describes these same machines as standing 100 feet tall and weighing 800 tons. A separate source describing the Conneaut machines gives yet another figure, 950 tons and 88 feet. Part of that gap probably comes down to whether a given count includes the full traveling gantry and undercarriage, or only the working leg and bucket assembly, and part of it is different sources disagreeing, decades apart, about a machine nobody thought to weigh on a certified scale at the time. Here is what can be stated with confidence. Published weights for the Cleveland machines run from roughly 550 tons up to 800, depending on what gets counted, and the machines themselves stood somewhere near 100 feet, give or take. Even the low end of that range is more steel than most people will ever stand beside in their lives. Whatever the exact weight, the machine's motors tell you where the engineering effort went. The beam hoist alone ran on a 275 horsepower motor, enough to lift the leg and a full 17-ton bucket clear of a ship's hold on every cycle. A separate 120 horsepower motor closed the jaws of the bucket, squeezing them shut on a bite of ore hard enough to hold 17 tons without spilling it on the way up. A third motor, a modest 25 horsepower, handled nothing but rotating the bucket, turning it to scrape fore and aft along the hatch. A fourth motor, rated at 100 horsepower, ran the hopper gates, controlling exactly when several tons of ore sitting in the Larry car dropped down into a waiting rail car rather than piling up in the wrong spot, timing that mattered as much as the reach of the bucket itself. Each motor did one job only, and the machine depended on all 4 working together every time the bucket went down and came back up. Electrical engineers who studied the Hulett at work documented something unusual for a heavy industrial machine built to run for decades. The motor that closed the jaws was, on average, stalled once during every single closing of the bucket, not occasionally, and not as a sign of trouble. Every bite, the motor briefly overloaded past the point where it could keep turning, and the machine was engineered around that fact rather than against it. An automatic acceleration control limited how much pressure built up on the jaws before that happened, easing the motor toward the stall instead of letting it slam into one, and dynamic braking absorbed the energy of the moving steel once the jaws locked shut, so the stall caused no damage to the motor, the controller, or anything else in the mechanism. A machine most people would assume needed to run smoothly to survive was instead built to survive being pushed past its own limit as a routine part of every cycle, thousands of times a shift, for the life of that dock. That cycle took roughly 50 seconds from start to finish, and each machine was rated to move 1,000 tons of ore an hour doing it. It took 2 men to run one, a leg operator riding down into the hold with the bucket, and a second operator working the carriage and the Larry car, with a third man, an oiler, usually counted alongside them to keep the machine's bearings and gears running. That upkeep never stopped. 6 separate motions, each riding its own motor and drive, needed inspection and repair through a season that ran only 8 or 9 months a year, and the machine stood exposed on an open lakefront dock through Lake Erie winters, whether it earned anything or not. The maintenance bill came due every year all the same, a cost that would matter more once something cheaper came along. Across a full shipping season, which ran from April through late December or into January, the dock carried around 80 workers over 2 shifts to keep 4 machines and the rail yard behind them moving. Becoming a leg operator, the man who rode the bucket down into a hold all day was still reckoned to take about half a decade of experience before a crew would call him efficient at it. A typical ore boat tying up at the Cleveland and Pittsburgh dock in these years carried something like 6,000 to 8,000 tons, though some ran as large as 32,000, and the 4 machines working a full ship together could average something like 3,000 long tons an hour between them. Even a machine this capable could not empty a ship completely on its own. In an ordinary boat, the 4 Huletts working together could reach about 90% of the cargo with the bucket alone, and in some of the newer, better-designed hulls, that figure climbed as high as 97%. The remainder, ore packed into corners the bucket could not swing into or scraped thin against the bottom plates, still had to be cleared by men working inside the hold with shovels, feeding it by hand into range of the bucket. Dock crews called these men ore hogs. That last stage of cleanup could not be sped up the way the main unloading had been. It still came down to men and shovel work, exactly the kind of labor the whole machine had been built to eliminate, now confined to the 10% or so of a cargo the bucket could not reach. Later in the machine's working life, some of that hand labor was replaced by a small wheeled dozer chained to the Hulett's own bucket and lowered 80 feet down into the hold, where it could push the last of the ore into position for the bucket to take. Set the old numbers beside the new ones, and the shift is arithmetic, not sentiment. A crew of about 50 men with shovels once needed roughly 24 hours in good conditions to move 3,000 tons off a ship. One Hulett, worked by 2 men and an oiler, moved 1,000 tons in a single hour. The shovel gangs that used to fill an entire hold did not get faster. They got deleted, their work absorbed into a bucket and 2 operators. What survived of that labor was the ore hogs, still moving ore by hand that would not come to the bucket on its own, but confined now to the worst tenth of a cargo. The record gives no death toll and no specific fatal accident tied to the Hulett unloaders themselves, and none should be invented here. What is documented is the exposure itself, men working inside a closed steel hold underneath a suspended 17-ton bucket, a small dozer chained to that bucket and lowered 80 feet down into the same confined space, and an operator riding a moving steel leg down into the cargo hold on every single cycle of a shift that could run for hours, in a job that took years to learn well. That exposure ran on schedule, shift after shift, for as long as the dock operated the machines. What that machine bought Cleveland, in return for all of it, was speed and cost that nothing else on the lakes could match. In 1942, at the height of wartime shipping, the Cleveland and Pittsburgh dock alone unloaded 8,744,139 tons of iron ore off 1,081 ships in a single season. On a good day, a battery of Huletts working together could pull 11,083 tons out of one ship's holds in 3 hours and 40 minutes. The cost of moving that ore, which had run around 50 cents a ton by hand and roughly 18 cents a ton under Brown's cable hoists, fell under the Huletts to somewhere between 2.5 and 4.5 cents a ton by one period account, with other sources putting it as low as 5 or 6 cents. Cleveland, on the strength of docks like this one, became the largest iron ore terminus on Earth. Over their 80 years on Whiskey Island, the 4 Cleveland Huletts together are credited with moving something like 100 million tons of ore, and Huletts collectively, counting every dock they ever worked from Cleveland to Gary to Lake Superior, are credited with handling several billion tons of cargo across their working lives. The dock had become the fastest link in the entire chain that carried ore from the mines of Lake Superior to the blast furnaces of Pittsburgh and beyond, and that speed was about to create a problem nobody on Whiskey Island had reason to expect. A machine that could empty a 6,000-ton freighter in a few hours changed the arithmetic of shipbuilding on the Great Lakes, and not in the Huletts' favor. If unloading no longer took days, there was less reason to keep building modest-sized boats designed around older, slower methods. Shipping lines could build bigger, and the bigger the boat, the more ore it carried per trip, per crew, per set of fuel costs, so long as something on the other end could still empty it fast. Lake freighters grew from around 550 feet, carrying 6,000 to 8,000 tons, toward vessels that would eventually stretch to 1,000 feet and carry 60,000 tons or more. The Hulett had proven that fast unloading was possible. The next generation of ships was built on the assumption that it always would be. A dock built to match 6,000 to 8,000 ton boats had no easy way to grow to match 60,000 ton ones, short of adding many more machines or rebuilding the dock outright. And neither option made sense once a ship could carry the unloading machinery itself. While the boats were growing, a separate and much quieter idea was taking shape, born almost by accident out of a disaster rather than a plan. On June 27, 1901, a steamer called the Hennepin caught fire and was badly damaged at Buffalo. Rather than scrap her, the Lakeshore Stone Company bought the burned hull and refitted it with something new, a conveyor belt system built into the ship itself, letting her unload her own cargo without a single piece of shoreside machinery. Historians generally credit the rebuilt Hennepin, working around 1902, as the first self-unloading vessel on the lakes. Where a Hulett reached down from the dock to lift ore out of a ship, a self-unloader carried its own conveyor system built into the hull, moving its cargo without any help from shore at all. It was not an elegant solution, and it was not fast by later standards, but it worked, and it did not need a dock full of steel gantries or a crew of 80 men to operate. In 1908, a ship called the Wyandotte became the first vessel built from the keel up as a self-unloader rather than converted after the fact, proving the idea could be designed in from the start instead of bolted on as a repair. For decades, the self-unloader stayed a minority technology, useful on certain routes but nowhere close to displacing the big fixed-shore machines. That changed through the 1970s when adoption of self-unloading technology accelerated sharply across the American side of the lakes. Through that decade, more and more new ships came off the ways as self-unloaders as a matter of course rather than as an experiment, and the fixed-shore Hulett went from being the fastest option on the lakes to being one option among several to being the slow one. The reason comes down to an unglamorous list of costs that a Hulett dock could never escape. A Hulett was bolted to one dock and could not follow the ore trade if it shifted to a different port. It needed a trained crew on site, including an operator who had spent years learning to run the leg, plus an oiler, plus the roughly 80 other workers needed across a season to keep the whole dock functioning behind it. It needed shoreside maintenance year-round, even though the shipping season itself ran only about 8 or 9 months, so a fixed dock machine earned nothing for a quarter of the year while still needing upkeep, and it depended on a ship having hatches laid out in a pattern the bucket could reach into. A self-unloader carried none of that baggage. It brought its own conveyor system wherever it went, so it could work almost any berth with almost no shore equipment at all. It needed only a small crew aboard, already part of the ship's normal complement, rather than a specialized dock workforce paid to stand by an idle machine for a third of the year. And it was fast in a way that made the Hulett's own speed look almost modest. A self-unloader could discharge its entire cargo in about 2 hours, competitive with anything a battery of Huletts could manage, while needing almost nobody ashore to make it happen. The Hulett proved that a lake freighter could be emptied fast enough to justify building it bigger. Building it bigger turned the fixed-shore machine, however good it was, into a bottleneck the moment a boat outgrew what the dock could handle in a season. Once shipbuilders had already solved the problem of moving conveyor machinery, hoppers, and gates onto a hull to feed bigger cargo runs faster, it made more and more financial sense to put the entire unloading function aboard the ship permanently, cutting the shore dock and its crew out of the cost structure altogether. The machine that had made Cleveland the fastest port on the lakes had, by being that fast, helped make the case for boats that no longer needed a port machine at all. The turning point arrived at Whiskey Island on August 12, 1979, when the first 1,000-foot self-unloader on the Great Lakes tied up at the Cleveland and Pittsburgh dock. The four Huletts that had built the dock's reputation stood in place along the rail, exactly as they had for 67 years, while a ship nearly twice the length of anything they were designed around emptied its own holds using machinery built into its own hull. The Huletts had not failed at anything. They still worked. They were no longer the fastest or the cheapest way to get ore off a boat, and in an industry run on fractions of a cent per ton, that was enough to end their careers. Through the 1980s, the machines on Whiskey Island worked less and less as more of the fleet converted to self-unloaders, and elsewhere on the lakes, the same pattern played out on a faster clock. At Conneaut, where the whole story had begun in 1899, the Huletts were scrapped in the early 1980s, though accounts differ on exactly how that process unfolded, with some reports describing idle machines still standing there as late as 1992. On the Cleveland and Pittsburgh dock in Cleveland, the end came on December 18, 1992, when the Canadian freighter Le Moyne pulled away from Whiskey Island, carrying the last cargo the four Huletts would ever unload. It closed out that year's shipping season, and it closed out decades of work on that one dock, without ceremony, because nobody unloading that final boat had much reason to think it was the last one. What followed did not look like the end of a story so much as the start of a much slower and stranger one, because nearly everyone involved in what happened next agreed, at some point, that the machines were worth saving, and they were dismantled all the same. In 1993, Cleveland City Council granted the four remaining Huletts on Whiskey Island local landmark status, formal recognition that the machines mattered as historical objects and not merely as retired equipment sitting on a working port. Landmark status came with no funding attached and created no legal requirement that the machines be preserved. It only meant that removing them would now be a public fight rather than a quiet maintenance decision. 5 years later, on August 2, 1998, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers presented a plaque naming the Huletts a historic mechanical engineering landmark, putting them in the same category as other machines judged to have changed how an entire industry worked. 6 weeks after that plaque went up, the Cleveland-Cuyahoga County Port Authority announced plans to scrap all four machines. Port Authority spokesman Gary Failer explained the reasoning in blunt economic terms that had nothing to do with history, saying, "Our other deep-water docks are operating at 130% capacity. It's like we are packing 10 pounds of potatoes into a 5-pound sack there." Those other deep-water docks were carrying the ore, coal, and bulk cargo that Cleveland's waterfront still needed handled somewhere, and the Port Authority's math treated the idle Hulett dock as square footage the harbor could no longer afford to set aside for four machines that had not moved cargo in years. The dock the Huletts stood on had become more valuable empty, cleared for other cargo, than it was as a home for four idle machines nobody was paying to run anymore. Opposition formed quickly. A group calling itself the Committee to Save Cleveland's Huletts took up the fight, joined by local historical consultant Carol Poe Miller and by Robert Vogel, a past president of the Society for Industrial Archaeology and curator emeritus at the Smithsonian. A fight to save an industrial site tends to need someone with outside professional standing willing to put a name behind it, and a past president of a National Industrial Archaeology Society carried exactly that kind of weight. Miller made her case for keeping the machines in place directly, saying, "History is where you find it, where it happened, and this is where the Huletts operated for 80 years. Nobody involved disputed that the machines held value. The dispute was over whether that value could survive being moved, cut apart, or held in storage indefinitely, and that argument turned out to be far harder to win than the first one. The numbers made it harder still. Estimates put the cost of dismantling a single one of the four machines at around $500,000, and that figure covered only taking a Hulett apart, not moving it anywhere or putting it back together. A separate $100,000 was floated only to hire a professional fundraiser to help raise money for eventual reconstruction, a bill for the process of asking for money rather than for any actual steel work. In 1999, the fight ended in a compromise that pleased almost nobody completely. All 4 machines would be dismantled, 2 would be scrapped outright, and 2 would be disassembled into pieces and stored on Whiskey Island, kept in reserve for the possibility of future reassembly and public display. Scrapping half of them cut the immediate cost roughly in half as well, while keeping the other 2 in storage preserved the chance, however thin, of eventually putting a working leg and bucket back on public display. Conrail, which had taken ownership of the dock and its machines from the Pennsylvania Railroad, carried out the dismantling, and by 2000, all 4 Huletts, once the tallest and fastest things on that stretch of shoreline, existed only as numbered steel components in storage or as scrap. That compromise solved the immediate political problem and created a much longer one. A landmark, once it has been taken apart into pieces that fit on a flatbed truck, stops being a landmark and becomes a storage problem, and storage problems do not resolve themselves. The 2 stored machines needed a permanent site with someone willing to take responsibility for it, and for years nobody stepped forward with one. In 2019, a specific plan finally took shape to display a Hulett bucket and leg near the museum steamship William G. Mather, itself a preserved Great Lakes ore carrier, docked in Cleveland, giving visitors a chance to see the loading end and the unloading end of the same trade side by side. That plan collapsed when the land it depended on reverted to city control under a change of administration, and the pieces went back into storage with no site attached to them at all. Later preservation efforts fell to Canalway Partners, a non-profit that took up the cause after the Mather plan fell through. Its executive director, Mara Cardenas, put the core problem in the plainest terms available, saying, "You need to have a site, and you need to have site control." Without both, there was nothing to plan toward, no foundation to pour, no place to bolt a rebuilt leg and bucket into the ground. Cardenas estimated it would cost around $3 million to relocate and rebuild even a portion of the 2 remaining machines, a figure that grew harder to raise the longer the pieces sat in storage without a destination. She described what the delay meant for anyone who cared about these machines in a single unadorned line, saying it comes down to a sadness when you potentially lose the last of anything. The Port of Cleveland eventually ran out of patience with an arrangement that had already stretched far past what anyone had planned for in 1999. Port President Will Friedman laid out the timeline without softening it, saying, "We agreed to store the 2 that are still on the bulk terminal for a period of time. That time frame elapsed in 2021. The port extended that informal deadline nearly 3 more years past its expiration, waiting for a preservation plan that never fully came together, before deciding it could not wait any longer." Friedman summed up the calculation without further ceremony, saying, "They've been sitting on our bulk terminal for 25 years, and the decision is that we can't wait any longer to move them off." By the time bids went out, the 2 stored machines had sat in pieces for right around a quarter century, essentially the entire span between the 1999 compromise and the port's final decision, before the last cut ever came. In February of 2024, the port took bids to demolish what remained. The job went to Northern Ohio Scrap Services of Cleveland, a company run by the Rosenberg family, with Matan Rosenberg directing the work on site. Torches that had never touched these machines while they still stood as landmarks now cut through the same steel that had once closed on 17 tons of ore a bite, reducing the last 2 Huletts on Whiskey Island to roughly 1,600 tons of scrap steel, hauled away in pieces sized for a truck bed. One concession survived the process. Reports from the demolition describe a 60-foot arm and bucket being set aside, kept out of the scrap stream in case some future display effort finally gets a site. Cleveland was neither the first place on the Great Lakes to lose its Huletts, nor the last. On the Calumet River in South Chicago, a set of Huletts kept unloading coal barges until around 2001 or 2002, years after Cleveland's dock had gone quiet, before those machines were finally demolished in the spring of 2010. Coverage of the 2024 Cleveland demolition reached for comparisons to convey the scale of what was being cut apart, describing the machines as heavier than the freighters they used to unload and taller than a Cleveland Guardian, with a footprint larger than a space shuttle. Those are journalistic comparisons rather than engineering figures, but they give some sense of what disappeared from that shoreline. Conneaut, where the very first Hulett went to work in 1899, has none of its own machines left either. What is left on Whiskey Island now is a landmark plaque from 1998, an American Society of Mechanical Engineers designation that still names the Hulett as a machine that changed its industry, standing on ground that no longer holds any of the 4 original title machines it commemorates. Beside it sits a single 60-foot arm and bucket, set apart from the roughly 1,600 tons of scrap steel that once stood beside it as 4 complete machines. The jaws that could close on 17 tons of iron ore in a single bite, stalling their own motor every time they did it, on purpose, for the better part of 80 years, ended their working lives cut into sections small enough to load onto the back of a truck.